The house stood at the edge of a quiet forest. Its windows gaped like empty eyes, lifeless and cold. The air was heavy, stagnant, almost suffocating. Branches scratched against the sides, mimicking faint whispers. The family who once lived there was long gone. No one in the small town spoke their names anymore. But everyone remembered. It was late October when it happened. The first frost had glazed the ground, crunching under hurried feet. Inside the house, a dinner table stood, frozen in time. Plates set neatly, a feast untouched. The smell of roasted meat and spiced cider lingered, oddly fresh. Yet no one was there to eat. Blood stained the walls, splattered in violent arcs. The living room bore signs of a struggle. A lamp lay shattered, shards glinting like broken stars. Furniture overturned, claw marks on the wooden floor. Upstairs, the silence was thicker, darker. A faint creak echoed, as if the house still breathed. The master bedroom door hung ajar, revealing chaos within. A mirror on the wall reflected the bed, soaked in red. Crimson streaks led from the mattress to the floor. Handprints smeared the walls, desperate and frantic. The youngest child's room was untouched, eerily pristine. Toys arranged neatly, a teddy bear on the bed. Its button eyes seemed to watch, unblinking. But the closet door was cracked open. Inside, the child's drawings lined the walls. Bright crayons depicted happy suns and smiling faces. Except for one hidden near the back. It showed a dark figure, tall and faceless, standing in the doorway, holding something sharp. The townspeople claimed they heard screams that night. But no one came. By morning, the family was gone. Only the house remained, holding its secrets. And the forest seemed closer than before, reaching with shadowed arms. The forest swallowed the house in an eerie silence. Trees stood like sentinels, their twisted branches curling toward the house. The wind carried faint whispers, indecipherable, yet chilling. Inside, the air felt heavier, thick with an invisible presence. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in unnatural rhythm. Those who dared to enter swore the house wasn't empty. Footsteps echoed in rooms where no one stood. Shadows danced, their movements slow, deliberate, alive. In the kitchen, the once warm scent of roasted meat had turned sour. Flies buzzed around the untouched feast, their wings a frantic hum. The dining chairs sat as if waiting for the family to return. One chair was tilted back, tipped just enough to suggest movement. Upstairs, the stillness held an even darker weight. The mirror in the master bedroom now bore streaks across its surface. Faint handprints, dragging downward, as though someone had tried to escape. The bed remained soaked, the sheets stiffened with dried blood. But the closet door, once closed, now stood wide open. Inside was an old suitcase, half-zipped, with clothes spilling out. Among them was a single shoe, small enough for a child. In the youngest child's room, the teddy bear lay on the floor. Its position had shifted, now face down, arms stretched unnaturally wide. The drawings on the walls seemed different. Colors had darkened. The sun was smeared into a dull orange. The dark figure was no longer in the doorway. It was inside the room now, closer to the smiling faces. One of the smiling faces was scratched out entirely. The closet door creaked louder this time. A faint thud followed, as though something had fallen inside. The forest outside grew louder, rustling as if alive. The whispers in the wind turned sharper, almost like screams. And the house waited, patient, for its next visitors. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the house. Two teenagers had dared each other to enter. Their voices were hushed, trembling with nervous laughter. The front door groaned as they pushed it open. "See?" "Nothing to it," one whispered, though his hand shook. The other glanced around, his breath visible in the icy air. The air smelled strange, metallic, with a hint of decay. Their footsteps echoed, far too loud for an empty house. In the dining room, the untouched feast greeted them. One boy pointed, his voice faltering. That's not right. How is the food still there? The other shrugged, though his face paled. Old houses do weird stuff. Let's check upstairs. The staircase creaked under their weight, each step a protest. Halfway up, the boy in the lead froze. Did you hear that? He whispered. Behind them, the front door slammed shut. The sound ricocheted through the house, shaking the walls. They spun around, hearts pounding, but no one was there. The shadows on the walls seemed to lengthen, twisting unnaturally. Let's go. This isn't funny anymore, one stammered. But curiosity pulled them forward, into the master bedroom. The mirror greeted them with its streaked surface. The bed, dark with dried blood, seemed to pulse in the dim light. One boy leaned closer to the mirror, frowning. It's just dirt, he muttered, reaching out to touch it. As his fingers brushed the glass, a handprint appeared on the other side. It smeared downward, leaving a streak of fresh blood. He screamed, stumbling back into his friend. Let's go.
Now.
They bolted from the room, but the hallway had changed. It stretched impossibly long, doors multiplying on either side. From the end of the hall, a shadow emerged. Tall, faceless, holding something sharp. The whispering grew louder, now a cacophony of voices. The boys ran, their screams swallowed by the darkness. The house exhaled, the whispers fading, and the forest outside crept closer still. The boys' screams vanished into the abyss of the house. Their flashlight, dropped in the chaos, flickered weakly on the floor. The beam caught fleeting glimpses of the hallway, stretching, shifting. The walls seemed alive, pulsating as if drawing breath. From somewhere behind, slow, deliberate footsteps echoed. The sound was wet, sticky, like boots trudging through mud. One boy clutched the other's arm, his nails digging into skin. Where do we go? He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The other didn't answer, his eyes locked on the shadow ahead. It moved unnaturally, limbs jerking like a broken puppet. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floorboards. Their feet refused to move, rooted in place by unseen force. The walls on either side began to bleed. Thick rivulets of crimson oozed down, pooling at their feet. The younger boy whimpered, trying to pull away, but the grip on his arm tightened, not from his friend, but something else. The hand was ice cold, its fingers long and impossibly thin. He turned his head slowly, dread clawing at his chest. Behind him stood the figure, towering and faceless. The sharp object in its hand glinted in the weak light. A blade, jagged and rusted, dripping with fresh blood. The hum grew louder, distorting into a deafening roar. The older boy screamed, yanking his friend forward. But the younger one wouldn't budge. The figure's grip held firm, dragging him back into the dark.
No.
Let him go, the older boy shouted, lunging forward. His hands passed through the figure as though it were smoke. The younger boy's cries echoed, then cut off abruptly. The figure and the boy dissolved into the shadows, leaving only silence. The older boy stumbled backward, tears streaming down his face. The hallway was still again, eerily quiet. But the whispers returned, softer this time, almost mocking. He turned and ran, tripping over his own feet. The staircase came into view, but it was twisted, spiraling endlessly downward. As he descended, the walls closed in, suffocating and dark. A faint voice called his name, familiar yet distorted. It came from below, beckoning him deeper. And the house waited, patient, for its next move. The boy's legs burned as he stumbled down the endless staircase. The air grew colder, damp and heavy like a cave. Each step felt softer now, no longer wood but something organic. He looked down and froze. The stairs had turned to flesh, pulsing and warm under his feet. A wet, Rhythmic thud echoed around him, like a beating heart. The walls seemed to sweat, dripping thick, dark liquid. He gagged as the metallic stench filled his nostrils. Behind him, faint footsteps began to descend. He didn't dare turn around. A low whisper slithered into his ear. "You're not alone." His breath hitched, and he bolted down the staircase. But the steps shifted beneath him, writhing like a living thing. He lost his footing, tumbling forward, arms flailing in the dark. When he hit the bottom, the ground wasn't solid. It gave way beneath him, soft and spongy, like a mass of rotting leaves. He pushed himself up, his hands sinking into the surface. The texture was wrong, wet and sticky, like raw meat. Something brushed against his arm, cold and slimy. He screamed, scrambling to his feet, only to stumble into the open. The staircase had vanished. He was in a massive, cavernous room, dimly lit by a sickly red glow. The walls stretched high, covered in writhing tendrils. At the center of the room stood the figure. Its tall, faceless form was clearer now, more human but not quite right. The blade in its hand dragged across the ground, leaving a trail of sparks. A faint, guttural growl rumbled from its chest, primal and hungry. In its other hand dangled something small, limp. The boy's stomach churned as he recognized it, a shoe, the same one from the suitcase upstairs. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They came from everywhere, overlapping, clawing at his sanity. "Run," they hissed, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure raised its head, though it had no eyes. And then, slowly, it pointed at him. The whispers turned to screams, and the walls began to close in. The boy's pulse thundered in his ears. The walls, slick with dark liquid, oozed closer, groaning with each shift. Tendrils extended from them, writhing like hungry fingers. The figure stood unmoving, its jagged blade reflecting the crimson light. The shoe slipped from its grasp, landing with a wet thud. The sound snapped the boy out of his frozen terror. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him rippled, alive. It clung to his feet like tar, pulling him back with every step. The whispers grew sharper, cruel and mocking. "You'll never leave." A sudden, searing pain shot through his ankle. He looked down to see a tendril coiled around it, tightening. It burned like fire, digging into his flesh. He clawed at it, desperate, his nails breaking against its slick surface. The figure began to move. Slow, deliberate steps echoed in the cavernous space. The blade dragged along the floor, sending up sparks that danced in the dim light. The boy screamed, thrashing against the tendril's grip. It pulled harder, dragging him closer to the figure. The whispers turned into a chant, rhythmic and inhuman. He couldn't make out the words, but they filled his head, pounding like a drum. The figure stopped a few feet away. It tilted its faceless head as if studying him. The tendril around his ankle released, and he fell hard onto the pulsing ground. For a moment, there was silence. The figure knelt, bringing its blade to the ground. It began carving into the surface, deep, deliberate strokes. The boy's breath hitched as he realized what it was doing. It was drawing something, symbols jagged and chaotic. The lines glowed with the same sickly red light that filled the room. The walls groaned louder, trembling as the tendrils thrashed wildly. A deep rumble shook the floor, resonating through his chest. The figure stood again, its blade dripping with a glowing substance. It turned toward him, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then it lunged. The blade sliced through the air, its jagged edge screaming as it came down. The boy rolled instinctively, his body moving before his mind could catch up. The ground where he'd been lying erupted, glowing red as the blade struck. He scrambled to his feet, slipping on the slick, pulsating surface. The figure moved faster now, no longer slow and deliberate. Its faceless head snapped toward him, its movements jerky, unnatural. The boy's heart pounded, his chest heaving as he ran. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, warping and stretching endlessly. No matter how far he ran, the cavern stretched ahead, infinite and unyielding. Behind him, the figure's blades scraped louder, the sound relentless. A sharp tendril lashed out, striking his leg and sending him sprawling. He hit the ground hard, pain jolting up his arm. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking, high-pitched and cruel. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard a new sound. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant. He turned his head, and his breath caught in his throat. From the walls, shapes began to emerge. Figures, half-formed and grotesque, peeling themselves free of the tendrils. Their faces were distorted, mouths stretched too wide, eyes hollow and black. They crawled toward him, their movements unnatural, broken. One reached out, its hand mangled and twisted, grasping at his ankle. He kicked wildly, his heel connecting with its sunken face. The creature recoiled, but more replaced it, closing in. The figure with the blade stood still now, watching. It raised its arms slowly, pointing at the boy. The tendrils surged forward, wrapping around his wrists and legs. He screamed, thrashing as they lifted him into the air. The grotesque figures below reached for him, their clawed hands tearing at his clothes. The whispers returned, louder than ever, chanting in unison. The figure began to approach, blade raised high. The symbols carved into the ground pulsed violently, the red light blinding. And the walls, alive and closing in, began to wail. The wailing grew unbearable, a sound that clawed into his skull. The boy thrashed in the tendril's grip, his screams swallowed by the noise. The figure stood inches away now, the jagged blade gleaming with an otherworldly glow. Its faceless head tilted, as if savoring the terror radiating from him. The chanting whispers rose in tempo, overlapping, echoing, building to a fever pitch. The figures below clawed upward, their distorted faces frozen in expressions of agony. One reached his dangling leg, its fingers digging deep into his flesh. Pain shot through him, and blood trickled down, feeding the pulsating ground. The glowing symbols erupted into flames, their light casting twisted shadows across the cavern. The boy's vision blurred as heat rolled over him, searing his skin. The blade rose high above the figure's head, trembling with a deadly anticipation. In that instant, the cavern seemed to inhale, drawing every sound into a void of silence. The boy's heartbeat thundered in his ears, the only sound left in the suffocating quiet. And then the blade came down. But before it struck, a deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath him shuddered violently, ripping apart with a force that sent the grotesque figures sprawling. The tendrils loosened their grip, dropping him onto the quaking surface. The boy gasped, his lungs burning as he scrambled to his knees. From the fissures in the ground, black smoke erupted, choking and thick. The figure stumbled, its blade slipping from its grasp, clattering onto the floor. The cavern screamed, a piercing, otherworldly sound filled with rage and anguish. The tendrils began to retreat, slithering back into the walls like frightened serpents. The grotesque figures melted into the smoke, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The boy seized his chance, crawling toward the distant glow of an opening. His body ached, blood streaked his arms, and his vision swam, but he kept moving. Behind him, the figure regained its footing. It let out a guttural roar, reaching for its blade. But the cavern was collapsing now, chunks of flesh-like walls falling away into an endless void. The boy reached the opening, the red glow blinding him as he crawled through. The last thing he heard was the figure's scream, echoing as it was swallowed by the collapsing abyss. And then, silence. The boy tumbled onto cold, wet grass, gasping for air as the forest loomed around him. But the house was gone. Or so he thought. Because somewhere, faint and distant. He could still hear the whispers. The boy lay on the grass, trembling, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The cold air stung his lungs, sharp and real, but his mind raced with disbelief. The forest loomed dark and silent around him, the trees like towering sentinels. For a moment, it was still, as if the nightmare had ended. But then, the whispers returned. Soft, faint, curling through the trees like tendrils of smoke. He sat up, his heart pounding, scanning the shadows for movement. The forest felt alive, its branches swaying though there was no wind. A low rustling sound came from behind him. He turned sharply, his eyes wide, but there was nothing. The rustling grew louder, circling him, closing in. He stumbled to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady. The ground beneath him felt wrong, too soft, too warm. Looking down, his breath caught in his throat. The grass was gone, replaced by the same fleshy surface from the cavern. It pulsed beneath his feet, faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Panic surged as he backed away, his shoes sinking slightly with each step. The whispers grew louder now, sharper, almost laughing. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A shadow, tall and familiar, slinking between the trees. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You're gone. I saw you fall." But the shadow didn't vanish. It lingered, watching, growing closer with each second. The forest seemed to twist, the trees bending unnaturally toward him. He broke into a run, his feet slipping on the pulsing ground. Branches whipped at his face, clawing at his skin like desperate hands. The whispers turned into voices, fragmented and overlapping. "Come back. You belong here. Stay with us." Ahead, a faint light flickered, weak and distant. He ran toward it, his chest burning, his vision blurred by tears. The ground shifted beneath him, trying to pull him down, but he pushed forward. As he reached the light, it grew brighter, enveloping him in warmth. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers stopped. The pulsing ground vanished. He collapsed, blinded by the light, unsure if he was finally free. But the last thing he heard before he blacked out was a voice. Soft, gentle, almost kind. "Welcome home." When the boy's eyes fluttered open, he was no longer in the forest. The warmth from the light was gone, replaced by a suffocating chill. He lay on a cold, hard surface, stone, rough and unyielding. Above him stretched a ceiling of jagged rock, dripping with dark liquid. A dim, flickering light illuminated the space, casting shifting shadows. The boy sat up slowly, his body aching, his hands trembling. The air was damp, heavy with a metallic scent of blood and decay. He turned his head, heart sinking as he took in his surroundings. He was in a room, a cell, with walls carved from black stone. Chains hung loosely from the ceiling, swaying as though touched by an unseen wind. A single doorway stood across from him, an archway veiled in shifting darkness. The boy's throat tightened as he heard it again, the whispers. They were faint, distant, yet impossible to ignore. This time, they were clearer, distinct words that sent shivers down his spine. "Don't run. Don't fight. You're home now." He scrambled to his feet, panic surging through him. The ground beneath him felt solid, but it pulsed faintly, alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging him forward. From the archway came a low, guttural noise, like breathing, deep and raspy. He froze, his legs locked in place, fear rooting him to the spot. A shadow moved beyond the veil of darkness, slow and deliberate. The boy's pulse quickened as the figure emerged. It wasn't the same faceless figure from before. This one was smaller, hunched, its body twisted and malformed. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of pale, flickering light. In its clawed hand, it held a chain, dragging it across the stone floor. The boy backed away, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The creature tilted its head, a grotesque smile stretching across its face. It spoke, its voice layered and guttural, echoing unnaturally. "You shouldn't have come here." The boy's knees buckled, his back pressing against the cold stone wall. The creature stepped closer, dragging the chain behind it. The whispers crescendoed, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. The boy clutched his ears, but the sound pierced through, relentless. And then, the creature raised its free hand, pointing toward him. The doorway behind it began to expand, the darkness spilling out like liquid. From the void came more figures, their twisted forms slithering into the light. The boy's scream caught in his throat as they surrounded him, their glowing eyes fixed on him. And the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the chain, wrapping tightly around his wrists. The chain coiled tighter around his wrists, its metal icy and biting into his skin. He struggled, twisting and pulling, but the grip was unrelenting. The figures in the darkness moved closer, their glowing eyes flickering like dying flames. Their bodies shifted unnaturally, rippling as though made of shadow and flesh. The whispers returned, no longer distant, but inside his head, a chorus of voices. "Don't fight it. Let go. You're ours now." The boy shook his head violently, his voice trembling. No, this isn't real." But the chain pulled harder, dragging him toward the expanding void. His feet scraped against the stone, leaving trails of blood as he resisted. The void was alive, writhing and pulsating with malevolent energy. Shapes formed and dissolved within it, faces screaming silently before vanishing. The boy's heart pounded as a cold wind surged from the darkness, piercing through him. The figures around him began to chant, their voices deep and rhythmic. The language was unfamiliar, guttural, yet it resonated deep within his chest. The chain jerked suddenly, yanking him to his knees. The void loomed before him, a swirling vortex of black and crimson light. Tendrils shot out from it, wrapping around his legs, pulling him closer. He clawed at the ground, his nails splintering against the stone. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "Let me go." But the figures only laughed, their voices hollow and cruel. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they drowned out his cries. His body was dragged to the edge of the void, the cold seeping into his bones. The tendrils lifted him into the air, suspending him over the abyss. Below, the void churned, an endless sea of writhing shapes and faint screams. The boy's mind raced, his terror giving way to a desperate clarity. He thrashed wildly, his voice rising above the whispers. "You won't take me." With a final burst of strength, he twisted his wrists, feeling the chain loosen slightly. The figures shrieked, their chanting breaking as they lunged for him. But it was too late. The boy wrenched free, the chain snapping as he fell backward onto the stone floor. The void roared, its tendrils flailing as though enraged. The boy scrambled to his feet, his body weak and trembling. The figures surged toward him, their movements frantic, desperate to pull him back. But the boy turned and ran, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone. The archway was ahead, now glowing faintly with a pale blue light. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, as the whispers screamed in protest. He dove through the archway, the light engulfing him in a blinding flash. And then silence. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the forest floor once more. The air was still, the scent of earth and leaves sharp in his nose. The sky above was dark, stars twinkling faintly through the canopy. For a moment, he lay there, his chest heaving, his mind racing. But then, faint and distant, the whispers returned. And they were calling his name. The boy staggered to his feet, his body trembling from exhaustion and terror. The forest around him was quiet, too quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the shadows to follow him. But the forest remained still, the air thick and suffocating. The whispers had faded, but their memory clung to him, like a splinter lodged deep in his mind. His wrists ached where the chains had bound him, the skin raw and bleeding. The ground beneath his feet felt solid again, but he couldn't shake the sensation of it pulsing alive. He stumbled forward, desperate to escape the forest's oppressive grip. The trees loomed tall and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Every step felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted him. In the distance, a faint light flickered between the trees. His heart leapt with hope, though it felt fragile, fleeting. He moved toward it, each step filled with a cautious desperation. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, steady, unwavering. It wasn't the sickly red glow of the cavern, nor the pale blue from the archway. This light was warm, golden, almost inviting. He broke into a weak run, his breath hitching in his throat. The light led him to a clearing, small and serene, bathed in soft moonlight. In the center stood a house. His heart sank. It was the same house. The chipped paint, the broken windows, the sagging porch. It was all as he remembered. But something was different now. The air around the house felt charged, vibrating faintly with unseen energy. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, threading through his thoughts. "Come inside," they urged, gentle yet insidious. His feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the porch. The door creaked open slowly, as if waiting for him. Inside, a warm glow spilled out, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally. He hesitated on the threshold, his body frozen between fear and compulsion. The whispers grew louder, coaxing, pleading. "You can't leave us." A single step forward, and the door slammed shut behind him. The light extinguished, and the silence swallowed everything. The boy stood in the darkness, his breath shallow, his fists clenched at his sides. The house seemed alive, its walls groaning, the air thick with tension. Faintly, the whispers stirred again, curling around him like smoke. But this time he didn't run. Something inside him shifted, a spark of defiance, a refusal to be their prey any longer. He closed his eyes, steadying his breath. The whispers grew louder, their words sharper, angrier. "You don't belong here. You're ours." But he didn't flinch. His mind reached back to the faces he'd seen in the void, twisted and tormented. The figures that had clawed at him, desperate to pull him under. They had been trapped. And he realized, with a sinking clarity, that this house was their cage. The walls trembled as if sensing his understanding. The floor beneath him pulsed, alive and vengeful. But he stood firm, his voice breaking through the noise. "You don't control me," he said, the words trembling but resolute. The air grew colder, biting at his skin, the whispers now a cacophony of rage. The room shifted, stretching impossibly wide, the walls dissolving into shadow. The ground beneath him cracked, revealing the swirling void once more. Tendrils shot up, reaching for him, but he stepped aside, dodging their grasp. He moved toward the heart of the room, where the light had once glowed warmly. It was faint now, buried beneath layers of darkness, but it was still there. The whispers screamed, the tendrils thrashing, the void roaring in protest. But he pushed forward, each step harder than the last. His hand reached into the darkness, grasping for the light. It was warm, pulsing faintly in his palm, and he clung to it desperately. As he held it, the whispers faltered, their voices breaking apart. The tendrils recoiled, the void shrinking back, the room quaking violently. The light grew brighter, enveloping him in its warmth, dissolving the shadows. And then everything stopped. The house was gone. The forest stood quiet, serene, bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The The boy knelt on the cool grass, clutching the light in his hands. It was small now, faint, but it pulsed steadily, like a heartbeat. He rose slowly, the weight of his ordeal heavy, but his resolve stronger. The whispers were gone, silenced at last. And for the first time the air felt free. He turned toward the horizon, the rising sun painting the sky with hope. And he walked forward, leaving the darkness behind.